do for yourself what the white man is doing for himself, don't say you're equal with the white man. That's right. If you can't set up a factory like he sets up a factory, don't talk that old equality talk. Who are you? You don't know. Don't tell me Negro, that's nothing. What were you before the white man named you a Negro? And where were you? And what did you have? What was yours? What language did you speak then? What was your name? It couldn't have been Smith or Jones or Bunch or Powell. That wasn't your name. They don't have those kind of names where you and I came from. No, what was your name? And why don't you now know what your name was then? Where did it go? Where did you lose it? Who took it? And how did he take it? What tongue did you speak? How did the man take your tongue? Where is your history? How did the man wipe out your history? What did the man do to make you as dumb as you are right now? This is American justice. This is American democracy. And those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail. But if you can't prove that a democracy is not hypocrisy, then don't put your hands on me. Democracy is hypocrisy. If democracy means freedom, why aren't our people free? If democracy means justice, why don't we have justice? If democracy means equality, why don't we have equality?
I can't say that I went looking for this. In fact, it was almost as though the writings were manifesting, and I happened to be at a place that saw some of the things coming to the surface. Channel 13 in this area, PBS, had run a documentary called The West. And it was a documentary talking about the western part of North America. And I saw that, and I sat straight up on the bed when I heard them mention blacks that were in the West. And they were calling the blacks the Kali. And I'm imagining K-A-L-I or C-A-L-I. And that got my attention, and I went looking for this nation of blacks that were in the Americas in the 1500s. They were talking about the conquistadors as being the ones who had seen this nation of blacks. So I went looking and found books and writings and illustrations and maps that had nothing to do with the Kali, but had everything to do with what blacks had been doing in the Americas from eventually what I found going on more than 22,000 years from the time of the foundation of Egypt. That surprised me to see writings that were showing Africans coming across the seas into the Americas and forming Egypt, what became known as Egypt. They did not call themselves Egypt, in the Americas. And when I say Americas, mostly I'm talking about Central America and South America, though there were cities and communities in North America as well. I found the records in Egypt and in other places, ancient records, that were talking about what had happened in the Americas, a full history of what these blacks had been doing in the Americas. I saw them building Memphis in what we now call Mexico. I saw thieves being built in South America. And eventually I saw the place that preceded both of those capitals. Egypt, as some people might know who delved very deeply into the history of those Africans, at first started in another place that some records call Dis, T-H-I-S, Dis. And it was said that Menes went from Dis and went to Memphis and built Memphis. But long before that, because we've got Menes at about 4,000 to 5,000 BC, but the records were showing Amen and Horus and Isis and Osiris and the other names that those are known by in the records, living, it said, about 22,000 years before Alexander the Great. So that's a long way from Amen to Menes. But most records try to pick up the history of Egypt at Menes. They try to start somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 BC. Well, that leaves a lot of that black history unknown, or at least undated. So I saw those things, and from there, I saw the other histories unfold. Once you know that the Old Testament is coming out of Egypt and then taking Egypt's cities, those Africans that we call Hebrews. Well, once you have Egypt in the Americas and you have Hebrews taking the previous Africans' cities that were called Egypt, then that means we have the Hebrews in the Americas as well. And that's what I found. I found those images all over the Americas. I found the cities that they built. They had already been found, many of them. They didn't have their African names on them. Some of them were already being restored by archaeologists, and they were just not telling you that these were the cities that were in the Old Testament and in the Egyptian records. I think secretly many of them knew this. So that would fit into the name of your program, the occult science. If it's hidden science, if it's hidden knowledge, that's definitely going to fit, because they knew that these cities were those ancient, classical, and even prehistoric, they called them, cities. So that's where it came from. I saw the records. It's been about 12 years since I found those first cities and the records, and have been working pretty hard from then to now to try to spread the knowledge. This is not the kind of knowledge that you're going to find coming out in USA Today or Newsweek or Time or even National Geographic. I've addressed this with them, and it's just not a subject that they really want to address. I thought it was a racial thing at first, but I came to Facebook several months ago to see. I wanted to test to see what's really going on, where the intellect was, where the resistance was, and I found we have as much resistance in the black side of humanity as we do the other side of humanity to these histories. Blacks are not ready for their own history, especially when we start saying Egypt and the biblical histories are occurring or were occurring in the Americas. They're not ready for that. So that brings us to today. That's where we are. We still battle that battle, and for those who are seeking knowledge and trying to see what happened, we have that, and we're giving that. For those who just can't get it, then that's another day for them. They'll eventually get it, or or not. And I don't bother myself too much with that battle. I eventually found that even slavery was a part of hiding the information. When Spain came into the Americas in the 1500s following Columbus, they knew what was here. We were taught in school that Columbus was trying to get to the Far East and, he stumbled across the Americas and that kind of thing. That's not what happened. Columbus knew what was over here. The crusades had already been coming to the Americas. I mean, once you have ancient Egypt in the Americas and David taking that capital city of Thebes and making it the Jerusalem, in fact, it was already a city that was close to that name. It was built to honor the African Heru, and they just switched the name just a little bit. Heru became Jeru. But once you understand that Jerusalem was sitting in South America, then you have to understand that this is where the Crusades were coming. So they knew of the history in the Americas. They knew the Holy Lands were here. That's why they're always getting on ships and coming to the Crusades. You could walk from where they're calling themselves Italy and France, and you could walk to that place they're now calling Middle East, but they were always in ships because you can't walk to the Americas from that Italy there. You got to get in ships. And when I would look at those ancient accounts, not ancient, when I would look into the medieval accounts and some of the ancient ones, to try to follow them on their voyage, it would always stop at the ports. It would be that they were getting in the ships, and then it would be a series of periods or something showing that this text has been deleted or it's not there or not important. And then they would arrive at the Holy Land or at Constantinople, which was in the Americas as well. And then they would go to the Holy Land. Even when you would see these movies, that were coming out of Hollywood, when they would address that part of the subject, they would say things like, well, to find your way to the Holy Lands, to find your way to ancient Jerusalem, go to where the men speak Italian, and then, get on the ships and then go to the place where they speak it no more, that kind of crap. But really what they were saying is they were getting into the ships at Italy, and then they were sailing across the Atlantic, and they were coming into the Americas, and then they were making their way to the Holy Land. So Columbus knew this, the churches knew this, Spain knew this. The problem was not, we don't believe that there's a land over there. The problem was the last time they had come over with these armed forces, they had gotten so devastated and they had been defeated so well that they had stopped coming. They did not try it again. The blacks and the others here had said, you slaughtered us so mercilessly in your first crusade and in the others that we are finally at an end of you. So if we see you again, we're going to return the debt on you that you brought to us. And so a lot of the people quit coming to the Holy Lands in the Americas, and those became known as the Dark Ages, because when you're not in a land and you're in Europe, you don't know what's going on in the Americas, and that becomes a dark era. You don't know what's going on in the Holy Lands. So, that preceded Columbus coming over. So Columbus's battle with the churches was not that I know how to get to Japan or something. That wasn't what the conversation was. It was, okay, once you get over there, if we're going to invest in this, how do we know that these ships are going to return, and how do we know that this is just not going to be death? That people are not going to just be killed once you get back over there. And so the secret order to Columbus was, okay, we want you to go to Panama, where Egypt long ago had started building the canal. Because once we go over into the Caribbean, to reach Jerusalem, we still have to get to the Pacific side so that we can get to that city in South America that is and was ancient Jerusalem. So his order was, get to Panama, see what the military situation is, see if we really can take that place. We want to launch one more crusade and try it one more time. And Columbus came into the islands, where we now have Haiti and Dominican Republic and some of the others. And I guess he got a little afraid himself. He didn't come into the mainland, and he kind of got addicted to the drugs and the women and the other things, trying to find gold. And eventually they sent soldiers to put him in chains and to bring him back to Spain, and to tell him, you didn't fulfill the obligation. The obligation was for you to check the military situation at Panama. And so on his fourth voyage, he made a beeline from Spain to Panama to check the situation, to check if it was, in fact, lightly enough guarded that they could launch an invasion and take that place. And then he went to South America, didn't go into it. He pretty much stayed on those ships. But he made this strange comment when he got to the Orinoco River that's coming out of the northern coast of South America. And he says, this river has its origin in paradise. It was one of the strangest things to be written by him. There was one other that's stranger, but this one was strange, unless you knew that this was where the ancient cities and the ancient histories had occurred. And he was right. The Orinoco River does originate in the mountains of South America, where Jerusalem and some of the other holy places were, and where Adam had lived. Adam, do I want to say this? Let's hold this one. Adam,
no, this is a cult science radio. There's no hold barred here.
We'll bring him out later. Adam is in the Egyptian records. He is named in the Egyptian records very clearly. You will see him under the name Atum, and Atum becomes Adam. He is Amen. He is the founder of Egypt. That's your Adam of the Genesis account, of the biblical account. It's Atum, Atum, becomes Adam. He's the same guy. And it's Amen, under his several names of Amen and Amun and Amun and all of those. So when you get into the biblical records, you're going to get to Revelations 3 and 14. You're going to see a strange verse that talks about this man called Amen, A-M-E-N, who lived at the first of creation. Well, for you to understand that, you have to understand that Genesis is not talking about the creation of the world. That's a mistake that we thought Genesis is talking about. Genesis is a record of Egypt, of the African nation, the empire that became known as Egypt. These are the Egyptian priests writing the history of their nation. And that part was adopted and put into the biblical writings along with later accounts of what was happening in Egypt. And so they're beginning it at the formation of Egypt, when Amen lived. That's why when Cain kills his brother, he's concerned that people in the world will kill him for the murder that he's committed. And it says that when he left this place, he went into a city and took himself a wife. Well, if you've got Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and now Cain has slain his brother, you don't have a city you can go to. You don't have a city of people. You're at the beginning, if this is the beginning of the world. But that's not what that's about. That's an African record about the history of the African civilization that became known as Egypt. Columbus and the churches knew that in his day. He talked about this river Orinoco coming down out of the mountains and saying, that originated in paradise. The other strange thing that Columbus mentioned and wrote about, and Washington Irving put it into his biography of Columbus as well, is that Columbus would go around talking about how he was going to capture Jerusalem when he made it into the Americas. Now, some scholars will argue, no, he did not say that he was going to capture Jerusalem in the Americas. Well, we don't have any record of him going to the Middle East to try to capture it over there. He knew that it was over here, and he really did have these high dreams that he would lead the crusade that would recapture ancient Jerusalem. So, when we talk about slave ships and that era, we have to understand that after Columbus, then they sent the armies back in. He had done some of the surveillance work to see where the armies were, some of it. And then they came in. Now, here's the strange thing. When you see Spain come in and capture Mexico, and when they write this history, when Prescott and others wrote this history of the invasion of the Americas, they title it The Invasion and Capture of Mexico and the Invasion and Capture of Peru. Well, if you look on anybody's map, you'll see how far those two lands are apart. And to find Peru, you really have to know something about the Americas, because it's hidden in a mountain on the backside of South America. Well,
wow.
In a mountain and the other one. But when you talk about an invasion, and you're talking about capturing two places that are as distantly related as Mexico and Peru, that should signal you that something is going on. But that's exactly what was happening. They were capturing the capital, the ancient capital of Egypt, Memphis, that was built in Mexico. That's why all those pyramids are all over that place. And then they went and captured Jerusalem, the other Egyptian capital that had been Thebes in South America. So the clues are everywhere for you to see it. And it's open, then you can. Okay? Before we get to Delphi, let's put in one thing, because if your listeners are like others who have heard this, they are sitting there thinking, wait a minute, there's a problem in all this. We've got pyramids on the Nile in Northeast Africa. We have Egypt there. Why would you say that Egypt is in the Americas when we can clearly see that Egypt is right here where these pyramids and the Sphinx are? To clear that up, you have to understand that there was an African civil war in the Americas. The biblical writings refer to it in their writings under the book called Exodus and some of those nearby. When these blacks revolted and had this civil war against the other blacks that were Egypt in the Americas, that tore Egypt apart. When you read what was happening in those wars and the killings, the outright slaughters, they will shame what's happening at Rwanda and some of these other places now. Or they will show you that those same kinds of horrendous things were going on in ancient times. And that's what was happening. And they had the upper hand. They were stronger under Moses and Joshua and some of these other African leaders, and they were winning against these African cities that were Egypt. And when you read that they were going to destroy them to their very root, was the understanding. Then those that were able got out of the Americas. They fled, that were running Egypt. And they went, they couldn't go to West Africa because that was one of the bases for the blacks that were known as Hebrews. They had made it to West Africa out of the Americas before they launched their attack on the Americas. So they couldn't go to West Africa. That was the strength. That was walking into the mouth of a lion. So they went around to the eastern side of Africa and formed a second civilization there, an offshoot of the one that had come here. Now, to be clear, the Africans who had formed the Egypt in the Americas had come from Africa to begin with. So the ideas that they brought to the Americas were already flowering in Africa. And when you look at Chepset's temple on the Nile, the ancient temple there, you know, it's clearly written when they talk about the expeditions to Punt that that Egypt's understanding was that they had come from a civilization that was on the eastern side of Africa where this expedition went to. And you can look at the animals that are being loaded on the ships in those drawings, and you can get an idea about where that place was and about where at least the Egyptians during the time of Hatshepsut were saying that they thought they had originally come from. So if the Africans from Eastern Africa had made their way into the Americas and that became the beginning of the Egypt in the Americas, so be it. But now they had come back to the eastern side of Africa and started building that Egypt. So archaeologists will tell you we see all these monumental buildings going on from the 12th dynasty coming forward. And that's exactly where I found the autobiography of Moses. It was in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. So it's all right there in the records for you to see what was going on and to be able to piece this thing together. Once they got to the eastern side of Africa, now you've got two Egypts. And eventually that Egypt came back in, got as strong as it had been at first, and reconquered its cities in the Americas. And you'll see those wars and those narratives from then on, where they're coming in and they're regaining and then losing and then regaining the Americas. Under Pianke, there is a very enlightening record left by that pharaoh. And you will see a part of Brazil still named for him. You know, and people don't discern it. You know, here is Pianke's name, first and last, on these two large districts against the Atlantic coast of Brazil, above the place that's called Sir Egypt del Rey, which meant belonging to the king of Egypt. That still shows on the map too, Sir Egypt del Rey. So you have this land that belonged to Egypt in South America that shows on the maps. And then right above it, you have this huge area of land, two districts. One carries the first name of Pianke, and the second district carries the second name. But under Pianke, he says he came from that area over to Peru, and then he's leaving an itinerary of where he's going in his reconquest of the cities. And he's traveling up through Central America in ships, and he's telling you where the cities are, the ancient cities are. And he's telling you where he's stopping and what he's doing. And eventually he makes it to Mexico, where Memphis was. And he leaves. He left this record that tells you that when he got to Memphis, he just started cursing, you know, because it was out on an island, and they could find no way to attack this city that was out on this island. And black historians don't quite get it. They did not understand that ancient Memphis had been built on an island out in the middle of a man-made lake. A man-made island built out in the middle of a man-made lake. And not in the middle, but out in the lake itself. And this became one of what they call the ancient wonders of the world. It was the lake called Tashi. And that lake was still there when the Spaniards came in the 1500s, and they drew illustrations of it, and they wrote about it, you know, and black historians are missing all of this good stuff because they're not turning their sights to the right places. They're not putting the ancient narratives against what they're seeing in the Americas. They want to follow Dr. Van Sertima's groundbreaking work, and I don't know if it's the correct thing to say groundbreaking, since there were others that were influencing Dr. Van Sertima, and he was extending their work. But what he was writing about was a black presence, and for some reason, no one had gone in to check the narratives, the ancient black narratives, to see if they were describing the Americas. And they were. So when you go into those ancient narratives, one of the things you're going to find out is that other blacks came from West Africa into Central America during another horrendous war, the war called Troy. That's a black war. That's an inter-African war called Troy in Central America. And it's bringing thousands of blacks out of Africa into this major event. And some of them, many of them, stayed in the Americas and started forming other cities on top of Egypt's cities and building other ones outside of those satellites. And that became known as Achaea, or ancient Greece. African. The Greeks are African, not the people now claiming the name. The ones who are in your ancient narratives, these are Africans. And they were in the Americas. And so when they're building these cities, and they're building them often on top of other cities or extending the other cities, so this becomes Athens, and then you have Sparta sitting there. You have Delphi and Delphi. They have the different ways they want to say it, but, you know, anyway, Delphi is sitting there. It's sitting there. Delphi, you will have the Greek accounts from the historians, from the Greek historians, the African historians called Greeks. And they're telling you the history of the city. And when your eyes are open and you're reading the ancient narratives, you will understand that here is the same place that ancient Egypt was talking about as well. And the biblical record is talking about it too, because this is one of the most famous oracles in all the world. Here is where the people came, the leaders came, the presidents of the nations, their pharaohs would come and ask the oracle, what say you? What should I do? Should I invade? Should I fight this? Should I join this alliance? What does God tell me I should do? And the oracle is sitting there at Delphi in Central America. And this is the place that Horus had come and taken once he defeated Cain, the biblical Cain, who is ancient Egypt's Khan, Khon. Once he defeated Heracles or Khan or Khonsu, now he's in power, and he makes this oracle become his. So its history goes all the way back 22,000 years before Alexander the Great. That temple is sitting there. That oracle is sitting there. And they would have games there, like the Olympic Games. These are the Pythian Games, every 4 years. And you will see what they call ball courts. When you find modern white scholars, they go all over the Central America looking for the ball courts, the Maya ball courts. These are not ball courts. These are the stadiums where they were having these athletic and musical games and competitions. You know, this is the Delphi Games, and that's why you're going to have a stadium there for the competitions that were going on there at Delphi. But now we're up to date. So let me bring us to this year. You asked about the place, Delphi.
Oh, yeah.
I found the ancient African records that described everything about the city, from the way the city is laid out, from the hills to the river, the situation, where it was, where the river is, where the stadium is, which monuments are there, what they look like. It named them, showed you where they are. And then it came to this amazing building. And they say, in this building are the paintings where the warriors would gather and talk. This is the painted temple. And then it would go in and start describing the scenes that are painted on the wall. And you have over 200 people painted in this temple. And Agamemnon, the African called Agamemnon is there, and the African called Achilles is there, and the African that was David's mother, King David's mother is there, and the famous Africans and that were called Greeks and the famous Africans that were called Trojans are painted all over this temple with their actual portraits by one of the most famed painters at that time.
Wow.
And the descriptions are there. And they tell you, here's Agamemnon, and this is what he has up under his left arm. This is what he's wearing. This is the kind of helmet he has on. This is what he's doing with his hand. He's standing. The man before him is kneeling. The one to the side of him is laying down. The one behind him is Achilles, and this is what he has on, and this is what he's doing. And behind him, over to the back, is a woman holding a baby, and the baby is holding his hands up to his eyes. When you have these kinds of descriptions, and then you find a temple in Central America that has every one of these images still painted in it, then you found ancient Delphi. And that's what was found. So when I told National Geographic in 2008, I was going to hold it. I didn't want to give it to them because I knew that ancient record had a lot more information. And I said, if I give this to them, they're going to go into the African king's tomb and start pulling those kings out, just like they're doing in Egypt. And I held it. I held it for 10 years. I just would not give it. But then I said, if I'm not going to be able to get blacks to understand and accept their own history, I've got to get one of the mainstream groups to publish the story so that our blacks can finally believe their own history. And so I gave National Geographic one of the ancient accounts about Delphi to show them what was there and to show them that temple was described in detail. That was June 2008. And the woman wrote back, thank you, Horace. I am amazed at this, and she's going on. But, Horace, I am not able to, her word, entice the magazine to run the story. And then I went to USA Today. Dan Vergano is the science writer. And Dan seemed to be very, very interested, and we talked, and I shared information with him, and we went back and forth for a couple of months. And he says, I want this story, and then the next thing I heard was my editor won't run it unless a Maya scientist or scholar confirms it. Well, they never confirmed Dr. Van Sertima's findings. In fact, when I talked to one of them in Dallas, he admitted, Horace, there's no Mayanist who values their career who will admit that there is a black presence in pre-Columbian America. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
What?
So they knew what they were asking me to do. They knew that they were asking me to get an approval that was not going to be gotten. See, so that kills that story with USA Today. All right, so then I said, well, let me just talk to an archaeologist, a scholar who I've talked with some years before, and I went to the professor at Harvard, Dr. David Carrasco, and I gave him the same information, said, here's Delphi. Vet it, and I need your help on getting the story broken. And he was very interested, and all of a sudden the contact stopped, couldn't reach him, he was gone, and his university finally told me he had taken sabbatical. Next thing I know, the story broke in January of this year that they have found the tomb beneath the painted temple at the city of Bonampak in Mexico. Well, that's Delphi. These are the writings that I gave them. And they did exactly what I knew they would do. They would start pulling out the ancient African kings. And that was their interest. They were not interested in showing the world that this was ancient Delphi and that these were the Africans that were Agamemnon and Achilles. They were not interested in that. They were not going to tell the world that the Greeks were blacks. Their interest was directly into getting to that tomb of that man who was buried, who the description said was buried beneath the painted temple, beneath the second room of the painted temple. And they went directly in it. Now, the explanation they gave was, we found this tomb doing conservation work using sonar. And when I gave that to other archaeologists, they just laughed at it. That's not how we do conservation work. They didn't find that using sonar doing conservation work. They used sonar to see if those descriptions were correct in saying that was a tomb with a man inside beneath that second room of paintings. And when they saw that those ancient writings were correct, they went into the tomb. and published that story. It's everywhere on the net. The tomb discovered at Banampa in Mexico. So that brings us there. Now, if you are an occult interest in your network, there is an occult attachment to the story. That man that's buried in that tomb was one of the most feared men, that had lived on the time of the Trojan War. This is Achilles' son, who had desecrated religion and the temples and had done some things that were just so horrendous that when people heard of it, they could not believe that a man had done such a thing to offend God, and at that time, gods. You know, they just could not believe that someone had done what this man had done. And for what he did, the sacrilege he did, when he went to Delphi, they killed him. And they buried him in that temple. And that's whose tomb they opened. One of the most feared men. And not long after that, Haiti's grounds crumbled. And you might not understand this, but once that happened, then the rain started falling on Peru and started washing away the roads there. That's a country that hardly experiences rain. But here's a rain so heavy that it washed out the roadways and stranded visitors to Machu Picchu. The grounds broke in Haiti. The rains came at Peru after they went in that man's tomb. Anyway, that's your story of Delphi. A lot of information. Once you come out of When Rocks Cry Out, at the end of that reading, you're going to be ahead of the curve, and you will know things. And more than that, the things that are in that book are footnoted. So it'll tell you where the text came from that I'm using. So you'll see it's not my opinion. You can see where I got it from, and you can go, and if you're really sharp, you're going to go into these writings and find everything else that's in those writings as well. I couldn't put everything in that book and keep it in a size that people would read. When I first wrote this book, an agent came in and she said that she could guarantee a large advance on the book if I would take out the black presence and take out the biblical discoveries.
What?
Yeah.
That's not surprising. That's, to me,
no.
brother, that's not surprising the way they...
No, it's not surprising.
Yeah.
Well, what she said was, and I asked her the why, and she said, well, if we're going to give you a six-figure advance, we'd like to know that we'll be able to get our money back. Now, the deal is, the way she explained it was that there are some blacks who are interested in black history, but it's such a small group compared to the whole of the readership group that they were not confident that they would be able to earn back a large advance paid on it. But that if I only gave them Egypt being discovered in the Americas without putting in the black, without putting in Jerusalem and the biblical, that they had a huge readership for ancient Egypt, and that they would welcome that book and pay a large advance for it and go forward for it. So when I would not take that out, then of course that kills my invitation from New York to publish the book. So we had to get it done other ways. But still, I got it produced by the largest book distributor in the world, Ingram. And so Ingram distributes everywhere, and they are the major distributor. Well, they will tell you that when you find these major pockets of Africans in South America, and even at the place where Ivan Van Sertima had come from in Guyana, they'll tell you that's a remnant of what was brought over during slavery. There were slaves, and there were not slaves. There were Africans kidnapped and taken out of Africa and brought into South America, of course. But when you have over 22,000 years of history of blacks in the Americas, they didn't all pack up and leave the Americas when Spain came in and started invading. So yeah, you're going to have the black cities, the ancient black cities, and the blacks themselves and their descendants in South America. So Brazil was major it's my belief that that whole nation called Brazil is named for the African who saved King David. You'll see that in the Old Testament writings, that when his son took the city, Absalom came in to take David's throne, he fled. And he went to West Africa. He went to Mali. They call it M-A-H-L-I, but it's Mali. It's M-A-L-I, Mali in West Africa. And that the king there who took him under his wing and kept him, who kept King David, was, they'll call him Mount Barzillai. But you just flip your R and your A and put it where it is. So either Brazil should be Barzillai, or the king's name in the Old Testament should be spelled a little differently. But I'm thinking Brazil is named for that king that helped David. In fact, when you read the biblical accounts, south of the Amazon River is Moab, which is going to put you right back in West Africa where this king was. So all those things are related. Yeah, there are Africans that were in the Americas long before the transatlantic kidnapping began.
I see the divisions between the Moors and the brothers that are following the teachings of Islam, and the brothers who have nourished a deep love of ancient Kemet. Mm-hmm. And I see these young brothers going round and round with these things with a lot of passion. But the problem is they're all talking about the same thing and they don't know it. They're talking about the same land and they don't know it. They're talking about the same people and they don't know it. The problem is words. So I thought I wanted to come on to the program to try to explain something that may make our discussions actually get somewhere instead of just the passion play. Mm-hmm. I guess the best thing to do is to try to go to the beginning of this thing. When I saw the records in 1996, started seeing the records that had been hidden. They were called the forbidden histories of this friar who had come in, Bernardino Sahagún. Bernardino Sahagún had come in after the Spaniards had come in and destroyed these African cities and populations, and then started attacking the non-Africans in the Americas that we call Indians. And this friar came in, and he found some of the Africans who were here that your history book now calls Aztec. Now, you have to understand, they didn't call themselves Aztec no more than Ramses and those other Africans called themselves Egyptians. Mm-hmm. Those are names that came on afterward. The term Aztec is actually derogatory. These were Moors. These were Islamic-believing brothers. These were Christian-believing brothers and sisters living in Mexico who had come over on those 2,500 ships that had come out of West Africa in 1306 and 1311. We have good records on those ships coming across the Atlantic. The failure was that the black historians didn't follow them to try to find out if there were records on this side that showed what happened to them after they left Senegambia, that Dr. Ivan Van Sertima told us about, and Basil and others. Well, there is a good record here. They started recording their histories when they got here, saying, and we arrived in the ships. We landed south of Texas at a city called Panuco now. We came in to the Valley of Mexico and into the highland areas. We had wars. We made some alliances. We became powerful, and eventually we became the most powerful. These are the Mandinkas and the Fulani of West Africa who had come over. They were trying to find a place to settle. Now, this place had millions of people already here. It had been here since before the Africans had come over from Africa and from Europe, as early as 22,000 and 23,000 years ago. in ships and had started building African cities all across the Americas. But here we are in 1306, 1311 AD, and these African Americans in 1306 and 1311 AD are now in Mexico, in a land named for the African Meshi, M-E-C-I, and of course, CO means land of, or region of, or place of. This is Meshi's place, the Africans' place, Mexico. And they come into Meshi's land, who had come in the BC period, and the place is full of people, but they're trying to carve themselves a place out of it, and with wars they do. But they notice that there is this island that no one is habitating. They're not building their cities or their towns on it. And these brothers and sisters know about ancient Memphis. They know about the West African city that was called Memphis. That was the capital of Egypt. 22,000 years before the time of Christ. They're looking for the ruins of Memphis, and they find it on this island. They knew Memphis was an island city. They knew it. Their own traditions had told of it. They were the people who had come over and populated Memphis. West Africa, not East Africa, West Africa. But then East Africa would come later, and South Africa and everywhere else was coming in. One of the wonders of the ancient world that they say cannot be found now, the lake that was called Tashi in some literature and by other names. Nearby, the other ancient wonder of the world, Heliopolis, still stands, showing its pyramids and the famed labyrinth sitting right there, the place named for ancient Egypt's Tehuti. It's now called Tehutehuacan, still carrying that ancient African name with the pyramids there and the labyrinth, the famed labyrinth still there, found by archaeologists. And they eventually said this city was one of the largest cities. No, they said it was the largest city on the planet, up until the 8th century AD. Largest city on the planet at 7 square miles. They're in Mexico, where Mexico City is now, built on top of those ancient African ruins. And now they found the ruins of ancient Memphis and rebuilt their city there, calling it after the old biblical name of Enoch. They pronounce it Tenochtitlan, but it's spelled T-E-N-O-C-H, Enoch, to Enoch, Titlan. So they own this old African city that dates to Genesis of the biblical, the African writings that we call biblical writings. And they're in this city that was Enoch's city and was also Memphis. And they build their city there. And that becomes the capital city that we start hearing is the Aztec capital city. You know, these Africans here. So when Spain comes in, they know exactly where they're going. They know what the history of this is. Their church has those books. They have the writings. You have to understand that once you understand that when the Africans had come into the Americas and built their cities that became known as ancient Egypt, then you're not going to only find Memphis. You're going to find that other capital city called this, sitting on the Yucatan Peninsula. You're going to find the African city called Troy, sitting in Central America. You're going to find the ancient city called Thebes, sitting in South America. That's why they call it Upper Egypt. And in the southland of the two lands called Tamaric, North America and South America. So you have Thebes in the south as the capital. You have Memphis in the north. And once you understand that ancient Thebes is hidden under the eventual name of Jerusalem because those ancient Africans had first built that city in honor of Heru, Amen's son, not Osiris's son, Amen's son, Heru. And they called it after Heru. And we flipped that H and J one time to give you from Heru to Jeru in the district of Salim. No, you're in Jerusalem, just the way some of the ancient writings still show that name. So you have Jerusalem, Thebes, sitting in South America. And you have Memphis sitting where Mexico City is sitting now. Now, you have to understand now. Now, when you have your crusades, you are coming into the Americas. You already know Jerusalem is in South America because you've been here before. Egypt had been here. Europe had been here. Rome had been here. Persia had been here. Babylon had been here. Everybody knew about the Americans. When they came in with the Crusades, they went to capture the ancient African city of Jerusalem in South America. But every time they do it, now they had good success that first crusade because they caught the brothers squabbling like they're still squabbling among each other over the different sects and different beliefs. And when they catch you divided like that, they just whoop all of you. So they came in and they were able to capture this ancient African great city sitting in South America called Jerusalem because they caught the brothers squabbling. Now, when they tried it again after they had been run out of the Americas, they came in again, and now they're trying to do it, and they find out the brothers have a strategy. Now they're working together. When they tried to besiege that fortress city of Jerusalem in South America in that high mountain, now the brothers from Mexico comes up behind them, these armies, and sandwiches them in. And now they get defeated, and they keep trying that. They keep saying, you know what, we finally run out of luck on capturing Jerusalem. It wasn't that you're running out of luck. The brothers have started working together, and now there's a strategy. So when in the 1500s they say, you know what, I think what we need to do to be able to take these African cities and lands and all the riches and the drugs and the cocaine and everything else that's in the Americas, start making that money again. To get that land, I think we need to go and whoop the army in Memphis first and Mexico first. So when we go down and attack Jerusalem this time, we won't get sandwiched in. So in this invasion in the 1500s, here the ships come, and they come into Mexico. How do you know where Peru is, and you just found Mexico? They know. They know exactly where Jerusalem was. But they were going to knock out the armies at Mexico and then take their armies down to South America and then conquer Jerusalem. But now, they have to hide this now. Because if you are the church and you're saying you have a right to come in and conquer and destroy and mutilate and slaughter these people in the Americas and have the church's blessing out of Italy, the Rome there, you better have some kind of good justification if you're trying to say that you're humane. So they come in and they say, well, we're going to introduce them to the religion of Christianity. And so, you know, it's going to give them a benefit. So we can do these things because we eventually, the whole thing is we're going to save them. We're going to save their souls. And they certainly can't tell you that they came in and destroyed Jerusalem. But the Vatican had an interest. Because when the church was developing in the Christian world, there were 12 churches. 11 of them are in the Americas, and one alone is there in Italy. But they wanted to be the head, and the 11 churches in the Americas would never allow it and would always vote as a bloc against it. Now, if you can wipe out the 11, you can become the head. So they had a vested interest in the destruction of the churches and the cities in the Americas. And Spain, of course, wanted the riches and the land. And so you knock out the armies at Mexico, you go down to Peru, and you knock out Jerusalem and wipe that city clean and rob it blind. But now you have to hide the histories so you won't be accused of destroying Jerusalem. And that's what was done. They knew that these were not Aztecs. Aztec means these people were worshiping the ancient religion of Sutec that some also believe is Set, ancient Set. And Set, if you go deeper, you'll find that this Set is also Cain in the ancient biblical writings called Genesis. Cain, that they spell as C-A-I-N, but in the other African records that we now call Egypt, he's called K-H-O-N, Khan, Su, who slays his brother Osiris, who is the biblical Abel. That's why in the biblical writings, these African writings that they keep trying to give to somebody else to say that they're theirs, in these African writings, you find two worships going on, more than that, but two major ones. In South America, Amen has become the church of power. In Central America, where Heru was given the rule of Lower Egypt, it's Heru and Isis and Osiris, who was Abel, who is then called Baal and El. So you have El in Central America, you have Amen in South America, and when the Persians and the Babylonians came over and whooped the brothers in Central America, and those African cities fell, and some who survived and escaped that slavery went into South America and joined that group. They brought their books, combined them, and in those writings now we have two names for the ancient deity of Amen. We have Amen and Yah and Yahweh and all the other names, and we also see it being called El, because they were worshiping Osiris, El, as Baal, as Cain, as Khan in the north. That's not the same spirit. It's two different ancestral spirits that they're worshiping. Now, I know my Christian brothers and sisters probably don't want to hear that part of it, that when they say Amen at the end of the prayers, it's actually the man who founded Egypt really founded it. It was existing some, but he really turned it into empire. Amen. Amun. Aman. Amen. And so at the end of the prayers in the Old Testament, it's Amen. Christ, when this African came, when this brother came, this divine brother came with this knowledge that he had, and started saying, look, we've got a problem. I know it's going to get me killed to tell you, but I'm going to tell you that the worship you're worshiping is wrong. You do not have to kill your firstborn male children to please God. God never required it. The man who required it was Amun when he waged the war against Mexico, against Atlantis, against Mexico. Let me try it again. Against Atlantis, against the Atlanteans at Memphis in Mexico. And he sent Horus's mother Bast to lead that charge. And the slaughter happened. And at the end of it, there was an agreement for sending him such bad tribute, such fat and bones instead of the meat, and such poor selection of crops as his tribute for saving you from the flood that had happened at Memphis that had devastated that land in Mexico. Then he says, okay, well, let me see what I can do to get this corrected. And when that war happened and that slaughter happened, they sued for peace. And the agreement was, okay, from now on, to make you remember to send me your best fruit, your first fruit, then this temple is going to be built. You're going to give your firstborn male offspring of stock and human. And so later, with that same worship still going on 21,000, 22,000 years later, then now even before the 1900 BC, you have the Exodus, the civil war of the Africans, and they're saying, look, we're taking South America away from the other Africans that were called Egypt, but look, this law here is too hard, giving up our first male born. And says, okay, well, it is kind of hard. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to let you redeem them. We're going to let you buy it back. And so here you go. Now you're able to give money, and if you're a farmer, your farm goods, or if you are a herder, you can bring your cattle and your others and redeem back your obligation of giving your firstborn male child. And so here's this requirement put on you. And when this African, this brother called Christ came and says, look, that's enough of this. You're wrong. The church is not going to tell you you're wrong. But Amun is not God. God is love. It's a spirit. It's not this man's spirit. And so you cannot worship both God and Amun. And can't leave that in there. Put an M on the front of it and says you can't worship God and Mammon, riches. No, you got to open your eyes so you can understand what happened. And so here's the history that's unfolding in the Americas. And then when these invasions happen in the 1500s AD, and these ships come in and they whoop these African cities on the place that had been ancient Memphis, that had been Enoch's African city. All Genesis is African. All Deuteronomy is African. All Old Testament is African. These are African histories. It wasn't that Moses' wife was black. Moses is black. All of them are black. And you're sitting there trying to find who in the Old Testament is black. No, the problem now is who in the Old Testament was not. That's where we are. And some resist it, and that's okay. They'll catch up eventually. But Amun is at the beginning, and Amun names the land. He's loving it. It's a beautiful land. He's sitting there with his throne. He's left Yucatan. He's whooped his father. He's now the king. He puts his throne away from the Yucatan into South America at the top of that mountain, that holy mountain where Jerusalem is eventually built. And he is even higher than that, up into the mountain peak north of that. That David eventually buys that land when he finds out that's where Amun had his throne, and said, let's build a temple right here where Amun was, because we are worshiping Amun after all. And so they built that temple where Amun had his throne. So your Ark of the Covenant, which is actually a boat, which is actually an ark, just like the Ark of Noah, it is still an ark when it becomes the Ark of the Covenant. It is a ship. And when you look at ancient Egypt and you look on the walls, you see them carrying this ship. Has a little house, little box on it, where Amun likeness sits on the judgment seat. And the two cherubs, Isis and her sister Nephthys, their wings protect over the covering. There's your Ark of the Covenant that people say they cannot find. It's sitting and staring you right in your eyes. And when David bought that piece of land, he knew exactly what he was buying. He knew exactly where that temple was going to be built, and Solomon built it there. And they thought the temple was built in the city of Jerusalem. No, the African city of Jerusalem, sitting in that mountain, sits upriver from where Amun's throne had been. That's why when you read in the African literature that we call the biblical narratives, it says that when Solomon built this city for Pharaoh's daughter and for his own palace and for the temple and the little temple for the ark, that they gathered all the leaders together and then took the ark up out of the city of David. Up and out of the city of David, because it was going almost 50 miles downriver to the place where Amun's throne had been. These are things that we've not been told. Find that you in the Americas, 22,000 BC, building cities and having nation building and doing everything in the Americas from then up until now. Amun named that land the beautiful land, the word for beautiful, Mary, M-A-R-E, in some spellings, Mary. And the land, of course, means Ta, T-A, Ta, the land of, beautiful land, Ta Mary. And Ta Mary is still applied to the land. And just as the ancient Africans said, there is a northland and a southland. Now we have North to Mary and South to Mary. We simply move the Ta to the end of the word and call it America. South America, North America, you're living in the land that was named by Egypt. Here are your Moors, who are named from Tamari, from the M and the R. You get your Moor. So even in the ancient African literature called biblical, you find Amorites, who lived on the north side of the Amazon River and went all the way up through Venezuela, what is now called Colombia, Guyana, all of that. Now we're going to get you a little deeper, something I haven't told before. Because that land is also called Syria. Here is your Asia. So when you hear brothers talking about, that's an Asiatic term. You're not African. Dude, Asia was Africa. They're all in the same place. These are Africans. You don't know that the Phoenicians are Africans. You don't know that their city Tyre is sitting right there off of Venezuela on that island that's connected by a man-made causeway, because you did not read that Alexander the Great built that causeway out to capture Tyre. You don't know that that national forest is there that's hiding the ruins still have Tyre's name in it. You have not deciphered that Venezuela is Phoenicia. The way you find your ancient landscapes and geography is to find the cities. If you want to know where Phoenicia was, find the major cities of Phoenicia. Want to know where major Asia was? Find the major cities that were given for Asia in ancient times. Once you find Miletus there, once you find Antioch there, once you find Tyre sitting there, once you find Tyre's old name Korah sitting on the mainland where Tyre was at first, once you go around and find Akit, that's now Caracas, and you see these other places and see Guyana, which they changed the name of, was Sayana or Sinai. Once you find the places, then you know where the ancient writings are talking about. And now you're ready to discuss and have a lively and fruitful discussion. Don't get tied up in terms, because you don't know your terms until you go back in your geography. After the 12 years of looking through the ancient literature to find where the cities were, I had them, and I knew where the places were. But I wanted to be more exact. I wanted to get as exact as I could, so that when a brother said, here is Asia, I didn't want it to cut off before it hit Panama if it actually went into Panama. I wanted to know exactly. I wanted to find as much as I could, and I want many of the ancient maps, because this information was so valuable. They would code the maps. They would have the lands there, but they would cut it and then reattach it. And when you look at it on the map, you say, well, wait, I don't see any land on the planet that looks like this. You know, but you have to understand that that straight line there on that map is the section where you take it off, and here is Upper Egypt, and you put it where it needs to be, and then that leaves you with Lower Egypt there. It's like that. They had the maps coded. Even the ancient Roman map, called now the Punic map, it would show you where the cities were. It would show you where the regions were. But if you didn't know how to put that map together, you wouldn't know where these cities actually were in the Americas, because it was valuable. But understand, West Africa is so close to South America that it made it very easy for them to have commerce back and forth. They didn't question how Columbus would get on the ship and come to the Americas. They never questioned. Never. The Vikings, nobody. Everybody could, as long as you were not black, you could be in a ship, and nobody would question you being in a ship. But as soon as you put a black in a ship, as soon as you put an African in a ship, then that was a problem. Well, how did it get there? And I would hear young brothers, putting their arguments up, and they were saying, well, Egypt came over in reed boats like it was proven. No, the heck no, they didn't. These brothers knew how to make seaworthy ships, and when rocks cry out, when that book finally hit, then the archaeologists started saying, well, you know what? Okay, now that it's out, we'll go on and show you what we found. We've got the remains of the wooden ships that ancient Egypt was using to go across the sea, not down the Nile, but across the sea.
Right.
So they started letting those discoveries out that were on the east coast of the Egypt and Northeast Africa. They've not shown the ones that were here in the Americas. You want to see a ship here in the Americas? Go to Benin Morocco, go into that end room, and you'll see a man standing there with lines going across the wall above his head, and you don't know it, but that's Agamemnon's ship that's been painted there. And nobody has told anything about it. I gave it to National Geographic 2 years ago. So they went in and got the Black King out of it and announced that story earlier this year, but they still didn't announce to you that this was an African city and that the discovery came from African records that showed this city, showed those paintings, and named every one of those black painted people in that temple to be the ancient Greeks and ancient Trojans of antiquity. All black. Trojans, all black. Greeks, all black. Agamemnon sitting there, black, with his Zulu, with his Zulu clothing on, and Achilles right behind him with his. And that's Achilles' son whose tomb they went into and pulled those skeletons and started messing with them and all that crap. That was Achilles' son buried in that tomb, as the ancient African writings told. That's how they found the tomb. Because I gave them the ancient writings to try to start getting this stuff published into our schools so our kids could get this information, and it wouldn't just be a couple of brothers on the corner in Harlem, debating about knowledge. They could start having it in the textbooks, but apparently, even that was not good enough. So even after they found the tomb, to verify the writings and what the writings were said, you still didn't hear the story about the blacks in the empire. which is ancient Delphi in Mexico. If you want to know where the ancient places were, the important ancient places, often all you have to do is follow the cathedral, because they were coming in being real slick, and they were following, they say, the ancient writing that says, I will build my house upon you, upon hell, and the gates should not prevail. And so they were coming in and they were finding the ancient places and building cathedrals on top of them. So you'll have the black church, the Church of the Black Christ there in Esquipulas, that's showing you the major places in Central America where Israel was. Israel was actually the worship of Isis, Ra, and El. That we already talked about who El was. They had the Trinity. That's why you keep seeing those three pyramids all through Central America among the Mayas and others. It's the three pyramids. Those are the three deities. It's that Trinity there. And so you have Central America going down to South America. That was the African nation called Israel. See? And so this church was the capital of Israel. It's showing you where that capital was in the northern area there. And the southern capital, they went and built the black church, the Church of the Black Christ at Cusco, to show you where Jerusalem was. And then where Christ, the African called Christ, had major things happening in his life, they built cathedrals across South America on those places too. Follow the cathedrals and you will often find the ancient places beneath.
And a lot of those cathedrals also, from what I heard, a lot of those cathedrals are actually masjids and temples that all they did was come and change the actual facade on it. The facade, throw a cross up on it. And we thinking this, so-and-so mosque or so-and-so cathedral or so-and-so nunnery or whatever the case may be. Because a lot of people actually say, where is the Moorish architecture here, the ancient and the Moorish architecture here? I tell them it's all over the place. They just call it so-and-so church and so-and-so. If you go here in New York City, the oldest synagogue in New York City, if you go there, it's on 54th Street, and it says, built in Moorish revival style. There's a big plaque on there. And I used to always send brothers because they actually go there and take pictures of myself. It's built with the Moorish arches and everything, and it's the oldest synagogue here in New York City. And right around the time when I was telling everybody to go check it out, I hear on the news coming up in the city, our synagogue is on fire. It's burning, and so on and so forth. And I said, look at this. This is why we have to get this information and document this information now, because it's here. It's right in front of our face. Just now they found the ship. Right there, the African burial grounds where World Trade Center was at. Underneath the World Trade Center, there's a ship. Right. And they bringing out the timbers now, right adjacent to where the so-called African burial ground was at. And so stuff is coming to light left and right. We just got to be there, and like you said, be in place, because it's like what happened with the National Geographic. Also, you aware that the city that they found sunk off the coast of Cuba, 2,200 feet below the surface, below sea level? Right off the coast of Cuba. And National Geographic, I heard, was trying to get the rights to that, and the Russians and so on and so forth. But there's a city, and with their scanner and sonar, they were able to see pyramids, streets laid out, and everything.
Well, I tried to get with Ballard to go and find one rich discovery. Found out that we couldn't get to it. He does a lot of underwater archaeology. And the deal was that I had found what the ancient Africans called, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Where the ancient Africans called Greeks had this major naval battle. And so many of the Persian ships and Greek ships had been sunk in that battle. And I knew it was right off of the Yucatan Peninsula, which was ancient Greece. And so we were saying, okay, well, it's going to be, and every time that I would locate where what had occurred, it had been turned into a national preservation area where you could not go into. So you'll have to be aware that those things are done too. But imagine if it began 22,000 BC, and they had engineering and architecture and sciences enough to build the greatest cities on the planet and dams and sluices and other engineering devices even at that time, then you can imagine what's laying in the soil of the Americas, and there's no way that all of it can be in no way.
the African invasion of Spain. The Africans, Berbers, and Arabs gave Spain the greatest material civilization it ever had before or since. Yet, the Africans, Berbers, and Arabs so depressed Iberian or Spanish culture to the point it hasn't recovered to this very day. If you go to Spain right now, when they point to some achievement, it is some achievement the Moors left behind. They still hadn't recovered. I say every invader depresses the culture of a people and takes more away, ultimately, than they gave. I'm talking about the Europeans coming to the world, doing the whole world more harm than good. And if he say he is the bringer of the light, he is a liar and a hypocrite, because he brought no light, he put out the light. And that he is in a position right now of losing the world, and each time he called an age his golden age is that age when he has somebody else to exploit outside of Europe. And that he never had a golden age when he had only Europe to feed on. He is being pushed right now to a point where he is being deprived of the land and the resources outside of Europe, when he would rather blow up the world if he can't rule it. And so the people of the world had better protect themselves or prepare to go back and change, because he'd rather enslave it or destroy it if he can't rule it.
Alright, this is your boy Talaco coming to bring some more good medicine to our people all across Turtle Island, aka Indian country. I want to talk about, just briefly, I'm hoping this will be a brief video. I always tell you guys that, right? But we wind up talking and the ancestors get to expressing themselves and the videos go a little bit longer, but we're going to try to be very brief. What I want to talk about in this particular video is the history, an unknown part of the history for Black Americans and Native Americans that predates a lot of stuff that's known now. I actually want to take you back to the 1500s. Before I go there with it, I want to talk about how a lot of people, and I will say white people, either through the vehicle of ignorance, trying to take a position of dominance, call black people African Americans, when it is well known that their first ancestors that settled here came over on the Mayflower, arriving about 1620, And you'll see that picture with the marker that commemorates that. And you also will see the drawing as well that shows them getting off the boat and all that. Okay, so that's pretty well known that their ancestors came over on boats. And this is not a racist video, but I want to address a problem of racism that is perpetuated and has been perpetuated against Black Americans and Native Americans by people that want to take a dominant position or a superior position. And I'll get more into that in just a quick second. Like I said, I really don't want to be long on this particular video. All right. So it's pretty well known. It's taught in schools, all that, about the Mayflower and 1620 and all that. However, I need to take you back a little bit further. I need to take you back to 1585 when Sir Walter Raleigh came on, I believe it was a second expedition. He brought somebody with him that was very important, that may have even accompanied him on his first expedition, that helped to make it all happen. His name was Thomas Harriot. All right. He was an English mathematician, an astronomer, an ethnographer, and translator. All right. So one of the things that he did was to help to navigate and help them to get over here, from England. And he also did drawings or engravings, or however, he took images on the spot of the people that he saw here. And he actually made a book of his experiences here, and he made some very detailed drawings, and you'll never guess the drawings that Sir Thomas Harriot made. He drew pictures of the natives, speaking of the American Indians, and that wasn't the name we were given at that time, I'm sure, but I'll just say natives, as many of us call ourselves now. He drew pictures or made images of the natives that he saw in Virginia in the year of 1585. I want you to look very closely at the pictures, and I want you to particularly look at the image of the drawing on the native on the left-hand side. I want you to look very closely at the features. I want you to also look very closely at the hair texture. I want you to notice the wide brow nose. I want you to notice the full lips. Now, he hasn't any drawings, any colors drawn in, but I want you just to look at the features of this native, particularly here on the left, that's up front. Okay, I want you to see the very black looking images. Now you see the native regalia, the feathers, all of that. And also now, focus your attention on the native on the right. You'll see more of the, maybe, I don't want to say traditional, because native people, we can look so many different ways. But you'll see some slightly different features, meaning specifically a slimmer nose. And not that natives can't have wide nose. We do have those too as well. But you will definitely see some differences in features, okay, on this particular native here on the right hand side. Okay, so take a look at that. This makes me think of what Thomas Jefferson said about the Virginia Indians in 1783 or 86, when he said they looked more Negro than black. Now, some people will argue that maybe from escaped black slaves that had went into the different tribal communities or whatever, and you may have some of that. But what we're establishing right here, there were no black slaves in the United States at this particular point. Okay? Not right here at this particular time. And they were already there. Also, and I mentioned this in another video, that archaeologists have found the remains of black people in the Americas that date back thousands of years before any whites ever came and settled here. And in some of those remains, in the northern part of the Americas, some of those black people were buried with Native American artifacts and things that would tie them into that culture. What does that tell us? That tells us that there were blacks that were already living here. There were black people that were indigenous to the Americas before any whites brought blacks here in slavery. Am I saying that the slave trade didn't happen? No, of course I'm not. We already know that there was some trading of black people from Africa to the Americas, the Caribbean, and to many different places, England and stuff like that. We know. So we're not arguing that. But we are bringing out that there were black people that are already here before whites came and before whites brought a later wave of blacks to be enslaved here in this country. All right? So when white people use the term, and we're going to talk about black use in a minute too. I said this video wasn't going to be long. Hopefully it's not. But let me just say it this way. The term African American is not a correct term for black people that are born in the United States as natural citizens. You have different ethnic groups of black people. You have black Africans, black Brits, black Australians, all these different things. So tying it back to the images we're seeing here, you're seeing black people that were already here. And I got some more images to show you in just a second. So let me just jump ahead. Let me show you what the Spanish explorers, going ahead a couple hundred years forward from the 1500s, from 1585. Let me take you to 1816, to the images that the Spanish explorers drew, and they used color, of Indians or natives that they found there. I want you to look at these images very closely. You're going to see very dark-skinned people. You're going to see some curly, woolly hair. You're actually going to see some afros. And you're also, if you look very closely, you're going to see broad noses, wide lips. Also, in some subsequent images, you're going to see a mixture of looks. You're going to see thick, coarse hair. And you're going to see some of the images of the natives with smaller lips, some with fuller, some with different lengths of hair. But you will continuously, in these images, and again, these images are from 1816, you're going to continuously see dark-skinned people that look like black people here today. Well, at least the dark-skinned black people, because black people come in different colors. What am I saying with this? The relationship in this area known as Turtle Island, aka the United States, between black people and Native American people has been here for many, 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 many years. Maybe even into the thousands. So I particularly find it offensive when I hear anyone really, and particularly I will say a white person that is racist, trying to say it from a position, and not everyone uses it like that, so let me be clear. But there are some white people that use the term African American to make it seem as if they are indigenous to this land, that they've always been here. And again, we know that ancestors came over on a boat. But as it pertains to black people and native people, the proof positive remains that we've been here all this time. So my point is, how are you going to come and call black people immigrants as if we just got here within the last few years, applied for citizenship, took the test, and got papers to be Americans? We've already been here before the United States was even called the United States of America. And what I also want to say to black people that are jumping on the bandwagon of thinking that African American is the new way to say black, that is incorrect as well. There are African American people, that being a person of any race that is born in Africa, that is a natural citizen, a citizen by birth of Africa, and that person could be a black person, a white person, an Arab person, an Asian person, whatever, because all of those races of people live in Africa and are born there. So if any of those people move here, go through the lengthy legal process that it takes, up to 3 to 5 years currently, to become an American, those immigrants will become African Americans. But to any black people that are born here, you are full American. And as it pertains to the native side of us, it's very disingenuous for tribes to be made, or for native people to be made, to have to get a card, an Indian card. What is that about? We're already here. But we know in dominant culture, this is what has transpired, and we know the tragedy and travesty that has been inflicted upon native people systematically, as it has been inflicted upon blacks. I don't hate any race or group of people, but I just would like to call everybody to let's have more peace and more love and understanding and fairness between our different ethnic groups. None of us should be disenfranchising anyone else. Nobody should be taking a position of authority or dominance over anyone else. Is it happening? Of course it's happening. Is it right? No, it's not right. Okay? So what I want to say to, I have two messages. What I want to say to white people: stop calling every black person that you see an African American. That is not cute. That is not the new way to say black. And to a good number of us, that term is offensive, because it's saying to some of us, and it's saying to those of us who have some sense, who really understand ethnicity and natural origin, you're saying to us, we weren't born here, and that we're not natural citizens of the United States, as if you are a natural citizen and we were born here just like you. That is very offensive. Now, you have some black people that are fine with that, that don't understand this. Or maybe they do understand their natural origin, that they were born here, but they still feel more of a connection to Africa for whatever reason. And I respect that. That's their choice. But that's not the position of every black person. So I would say to white people, just stop automatically saying that. Black is not offensive to many people, just as you being called white for the most part is not offensive to most white people. It's perfectly fine to say black. Black is beautiful. And I want to say to black leaders and black people on television, CNN and different places. Stop calling all black people African Americans. Black people that are born here in the United States are full Americans, just like a white person is or any other person that is born here. The thing that I find particularly offensive, and this is my opinion, and I've encountered other people that feel the same way, when you call all black Americans African Americans or immigrants, you're saying, and I hear Oprah say this a lot, and she definitely knows better because she has a school in Africa. African cultures are different than American cultures. It's like saying, in a large way, that as black Americans, we don't have a value and a culture of our own. We haven't. You mean to tell me after hundreds and even thousands of years for those black people who did not descend from an African ancestor, or even for those who did, that they haven't carved out their own culture, their own customs, their own ways of speaking, their own ways of dress, their own foods, their own religious beliefs, own dances, all those things that make up custom and culture? And are you saying that black American culture is invalid, and in order to have a culture, a value, and a worth, that they have to go and ascribe to another culture, another black culture from another country to be validated? That's offensive. That is damn offensive. That is sending a signal or message that black Americans don't have a value. White people don't do that to each other. You may hear a white person saying, and I'm saying this from the point of equality. It's not like trying to be white or anything like that. I'm saying from a standpoint of equality and really just plain common sense. You may hear them say from a historical standpoint, I'm Italian or my family's Italian, but they will tell you I'm American. My people may have come from such and such a place or whatever, and that's fine. Nobody's negating anybody's ancestry. If a black person can trace an ancestor back to Africa, or they feel that tie connection, that's fine. But what I'm talking about is the value and culture that black Americans have established in this country and have been living in under hundreds of years. We have our own culture which is valuable, and we respect, most of us I'm sure, respect the culture of black African people. And there are many different cultures because there are many different tribes in Africa. As we respect the different cultures, of black people in different parts of the world. Black British people have their own culture. Black people in Italy have their own culture. There are even black Chinese people. Black people that were born in China, Japan. They have their own culture. Each culture should be valued and respected. You know what I'm saying? And in terms of our native side, we're still making strides. More tribes are getting their federal recognition, which I think is really horrible when we've been here all this time. Our people get massacred, genocide, land taken, records erased, and then you got to scratch and dig and wait for the BIA for 20, 30, 50 years to approve you, letting most of the people die out. It's just a really horrible political process. But I'm just one person, and these are my thoughts. This is my opinion, and what is factual is the information that I presented on these photographs. There is historical proof that black people were here before the slave trade, before they were brought over by whites. So I want to say to all of our people, both black and native, to let's definitely continue to have pride in ourselves, have pride in our shared culture, and to embrace all of our people and all of our ethnic groups. As we know, native people today are our ethnic group of people, meaning we have intermixed and married in with different groups, you know, different races. We've got black Indians, white Indians, Asian Indians, you name it. You know what I'm saying? So it is what it is. So I wanted to just to share this was on my heart and everything. So definitely speak up on here. Leave your thoughts. If you support the message of this video, please give it a thumbs up and definitely subscribe for more good videos and good information. All right. Yakoke.
I would not specify the day, but probably exceeding 2,000 years. The fact is that Columbus never came to the United States of America or North and South America. He came as close as San Salvador. There's a rumor that says that Columbus came to America. He did not come to America. He came to an island off America. Vespucci came to America, not Columbus. He came to the Caribbeans. But it is commonly stated, just as much as they state, that Columbus discovered America while the Indians sat down watching him doing it. Now, but the knowledge of Africans in the Americas quite knowledgeable to scholars. The fact that it's suppressed doesn't have any validity at all.
Let me bounce a couple of things off of you. One thing, this article that I'm going to be referring to our home audience and to our studio audience, this article came out in the September 1981 issue of Science Digest, and it's entitled Black Kings in Ancient America. You and some other black scholars believe that these people, African people, came to this continent before Columbus.
We don't believe, we know.
How do you know? What evidence?
The evidence is there. For example, when you go to Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula, and at Ecuador and places like that, they have caches of Carthaginian money found 200 feet down in the ground, meaning that there were pluvial disruptions and those money was buried. So it indicates a period of time, at least from that, when you look at the strata, you could tell the period of time in which they've been here. And when you're talking about Carthage, you're talking about at least 212 BC, when Carthage was finally destroyed by the Romans. Again, the Queen Makeda, which you call the Queen of Sheba, there are maps which Rome, the church in Rome, the so-called Holy Father, has suppressed these maps from the time of Justinian, showing South America and what is today called Central America. The maps there, and Victoria, Makeda goes back to at least 892 BC.
Before Christ.
Before the
Let me point out another thing, just from the same article. I don't know if we can see this on television, but here is a picture. Tell me what this is, and why do you see this as proof of the presence of Africans in America before?
That is the head of an Olmec, and the Olmecs were said to be the first of the indigenous Americans. And if you look, if an Olmec walked in here, then you would believe that he had come from the middle of Africa. And there is no doubt about it that all of the writers prior to racism admitted that the Olmecs were in fact Africans who had come across here. There is no doubt when Pigafetta and others, the point is that Van Sertima is writing and others, but Leo Weiner in 1938 at Harvard University wrote a 2-volume book for which he was fired about the Africans, Olmecs being Africans. And
let me bounce this off of you, okay? You take the same statue. You say, well, you say that they're obviously black features, thick lips, broad nose.
The stereotype.
Okay, the stereotype. Other anthropologists say, I think Michael Cole was one of them. He says that this is not a black man. He said the people who made these statues, which I understand are 8 feet high, the people who made these statues didn't have sharp enough tools to give them white features, so they're not really black statues. They're white people carved with crude tools. What's your response to that?
It's strange that the tools were not sharp enough to make narrow noses, but it was sharp enough to put eyelids. So it would seem to me that an eyelid is harder to make than a thin nose. But Michael Cole is no less a racist than the head of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, what's the difference between Michael Cole Reagan and the Ku Klux Klan?
You also agreed with this position that Africans were in this...
I have no problem, no doubt.
Why?
As a matter of fact, speaking about, like Dr. Ben mentioned, and you spoke about Michael Nico, I owned a book several years ago and still have it in my possession, by Michael D. Coe himself, who is considered one of America's leading archaeologists and anthropologists from Yale, one of America's most prestigious schools. In his own work, he referred to them as Negroid. And he went further to state the title of the book is America's First Civilization, what you call civilization. And to turn around and to tell these youngsters and other people in America in particular that the black men was the first to build any type of civilization in the Americas will be disturbing to Americans. And so...
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
Even if you're right, let's say you're right, what difference does it make?
It makes a lot of difference.
What kind of difference?
It takes the inferiority complex out of the black man who felt that his only beginning and relationship here in this part of the world is that of slavery. Then it puts him in the driver's seat because, again, they don't tell you that there are man-made hills within the United States. They call them mounds. And they range from in the Midwest all the way down the eastern seacoast of the United States. And they have found artifacts in them that are similar to things found in West Africa and in Egypt, which is Northeast Africa, that predates the arrival of the so-called indigenous Indians to these lands. Another thing is some years ago, one of the major television networks back in New York, I don't remember exactly which one, ABC or which, had did a documentary, and they said that these Olmecs are the ones who brought right into the Americas about 3000 BC. To tell blacks that they ought to be glad to enter into these schools of higher learning today in order to read and write, because their ancestors back in Africa couldn't read and write. You see what it will do to tell them that they brought right into the Americas? Antonio Pigafetta, that Dr. Ben mentioned, who sailed with Magellan when Magellan came to the so-called New World in 1519, when they landed at the land of Verzin, which we now call Brazil, they were met by people in canoes that carried as many as 40 people. And Antonio Pigafetta recorded that these people were jet black. It seemed that they came out of the infernal marshes. That meant that they were burnt. He said, naked and black as they are in 1519, 27 years after Columbus's arrival to the so-called New World. Another thing they don't tell you, again, you heard my associate...
Why haven't we heard these things before? Why don't we read them in the New York Times, Birmingham News?
If I stole another man's country, and I brought your ancestors here to work for me, could I tell you how great your ancestors were and still expect to keep you in slavery?
Well, let me give you a better, not better necessarily, but an added situation of that. Most black people in Birmingham, Alabama, like in Harlem, New York, are Christians, and they go to in a black community, a black minister, a black congregation, but with a white Jesus, because they didn't know that that Jesus, up until Pope Julius II, had the first black Jesus painted. He had Michelangelo to do it, but up until that time, the world worshipped the black Madonna and Child. The present Pope is going back to Poland to worship at the statue of the black Madonna and Child. That's in the New York Times. But what the Times says the next day, don't worry about the black Madonna and the Child. She was originally white, but there was a storm in the 16th century, passed by and turned it black. But the same storm must have gone to Spain, and then it went to Ethiopia, and it went to the Soviet Union and turned all the black Madonnas black. It was a hell of a storm.
that I shall begin because Diop appeared, one of the few who was invited by UNESCO to help in rewriting the history of Africa. There was a conference in 1974 in Cairo on the peopling of Africa, and for the very first time an international body invited Africans to say something about African history. Sheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and Théophile Obenga of the Congo. Diop presented a great number of arguments establishing the Africanness of the Egyptian civilization, but the most important contribution he made, and very significant contribution, was the linguistic contribution. Diop established clearly and beyond the shadow of a doubt, by showing thousands of intimate interconnections, familial interconnections between the languages of Africa and the Egyptian language, that it was structurally, fundamentally an African language, that it was not Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Asiatic or Afro-anything, it was African. And one of the things that stands out in our memory is what UNESCO had to say at the end of that conference in their report, that although they had made it quite clear to all the delegates that they should come well prepared, well researched, because this was to be a turning point. Many things were to be decided after 2 centuries of debate. Only 2 gentlemen turned up, they said, with well-researched papers. And who were those gentlemen? The Africans, Théophile Obenga and Sheikh Anta Diop. There were at that conference many brilliant Europeans, some of them Africanists, not just Eurocentric Europeans, many of them in Diop's corner. But everybody came expecting to repeat themselves because they thought that in spite of all the controversy, this was a decided and settled matter. Not only were we the creators of the Egyptian civilization, but that our equality in the world, the equality of the black peoples of the world, is not built on any biblical fantasy or any liberal sentiment. It is rooted in hard, concrete, historical reality. Diop was a particularly well-accomplished man. His first career was in physics. He had worked in the most advanced nuclear lab in Europe under Frederick Julio Curie. Diop gave up physics, or really he did not give it up, because he was to become director of the radiocarbon lab in Africa, the first radiocarbon lab in Africa. He didn't give it up, but he decided to use it, to use his scientific accomplishments in order to establish that Egypt was African. And when he presented his thesis, it was wrongly rejected. How absurd! How dare you say such a thing? The University of Paris rejected it. Do you know, the week after he died, the first people to write me from Europe to ask for a copy of the book that was in process, Great African Thinkers, the book I edited on Sheikh Anta Diop, who do you think wanted so desperately to get that book? And to honor him, and to buy his original manuscripts and to house them, the University of Paris, who had rejected him. Far more than the linguistic arguments were the other cultural elements. There was the peculiar form of totemism. The totems of the Africans south of Egypt were the totems of the Egyptians.
I'm surprised that no one mentioned the book When Egypt Ruled the East by Keith Seeley. What you call Western Asia, what is Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East, was an extension of Africa itself, was really Northeast Africa. And the people were interchangeable, and we seem to have neglected this very important aspect of. Then, in looking at Herodotus was no fool. Herodotus was a good reporter. When you told him something he didn't believe, he said he didn't believe it. But he said the tint of the complexion of the Ethiopians and the Egyptians seem to be the same. So let us at least concede, that's not an analysis now, that's an observation. Let us concede that Herodotus at least had good eyesight.
Came to America not as slaves but as masters. I have just come from a meeting in New Mexico before 200 professors who are studying ancient scripts, who have established beyond the shadow of a doubt, and I shall deal with that later in my talk, that the Egyptian script traveled to America before Christ around 800 BC. They have found on the Davenport Stela the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Libyan script, and the Iberian Punic side by side, reading the same thing. And it could not be forged because it was found before the Libyan or the Iberian Punic was deciphered. But they did not know the Egyptian had anything to do with blacks. I informed them. Because the Reader's Digest had a big article after my book turned out. Europeans in America, 800 BC, the same period that I had pointed to. Europeans in America before Christ. Who are these Europeans? The Egyptians. It's taken for granted in most of these circles that Egyptians have nothing to do whatsoever with Negroes. There are three major currents of Africa, about 100 miles off the African coast, that take you automatically to America. Once you are caught in those currents, whether you planned it or not, you have to get to America unless the fish get you first. Anything that remains afloat is pushed towards America. Off the Cape Verde Islands, the current takes you onto the northern tip of South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. If you're off the Senegambia, it takes you to South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. If you're off the southern coast of Africa, it takes you towards South America, and you could fall into the currents that take you into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. The evidence shows that there were Africans in America not only before Columbus, but before Christ. And it has been carbon dated, and we can establish this beyond the shadow of a doubt. Our libraries have been shattered, and it's not a question of the lack of libraries. In the Americas alone, there were thousands of books. Only 3 major American books survive, and they're not even in America. They're in Germany, they're in Spain. 3 books survive. One of them is the Popol Vuh, the Bible of the Quiche Maya. You have the Titulo Koyoi, which Jairus Boy mentions. You have other codices. These things are the few things that survive. The destruction of libraries in Egypt, the sack of Alexandria, which destroys, as I pointed out this morning, perhaps 500,000 documents. The destruction of the Moorish documents in which blacks were involved, not just blacks. You have Arabs of different complexions and races perhaps, but you have an Arab-African thing in the Moorish domination of Europe. You have Cardinal Ximenes destroying about 84,000 manuscripts in Arabic at a time when many Africans and Arabs and even others wrote in Arabic as the language of science at the time. And Timbuktu was razed to the ground twice. So it's not just the absence of documents, but the destruction of documents. Fortunately, history does not leave its mark only on written documents. History leaves its mark on everything. If you do not find the books, there are scripts. If you do not find, there are skeletons, there are sculptures, there are plants. There are many things that have left their mark, and that is the reason why we reconstruct history by going to all of those strands, into all of those avenues. It is not an ahistorical method. It is the only valid, genuine historical method to reconstruct the fragmented history of Africa and America. In the case of Columbus, for example, why is it we who are so familiar with the voyages of Columbus are not aware of the fact that Columbus never touched the American continent? Why are we not aware of the fact that Columbus remarked on this matter, not just once? Several times he mentioned on his 3rd voyage that he went along the coast of Africa
that he stopped in the Cape Verde for several days looking for black animals because he found both the Africans and the Native Americans in the Caribbean were sacrificing black animals, and he wanted to please them with a black animal as a gift. That he wandered further, finding no such black animals. He wandered further into the Senegambia current and was swept. He said he had 6 ships, 3 were sent on the normal route, and he was swept on the Senegambia current, making it in far less time. But Spanish metallurgists had assayed the metal spears and showed them to be African. The navigational evidence, because the currents move in that direction, and the Portuguese had noted the Africans had the navigational capacity and were actually setting out from the Cape Verde. The documented evidence, both of Columbus himself and of the Portuguese, the oral tradition of the Native Americans, all of these things are there. Until we pull them together, they make no sense, because they're constantly being thrust aside, because they suggest Africans are where they should not be. It was in 1858 that peasants in the village of Tres Zapotes in the Gulf of Mexico discovered an enormous stone head. This stone head weighed 10 tons, just a head, 10 tons. It was made of basalt stone, and it had vividly Africoid features, as Dr. Matthew Sterling was later to comment on it nearly a century later, that it was vividly African, vividly Negroid was his term. It had broad nose, very full lips. It was clearly one of the classical African types. It had a helmet, which had never been seen on any sculpture found that so far in the Americas. Close by it was found a stele, which indicated a date of about 291, November the 4th, 291 BC, 291 years before Christ. They were not sure, however, if that date necessarily related to the head. And at that point in time, no archaeology, no serious archaeology had been done in America. However, in 1938, a scientific expedition set out from the Smithsonian Institute, University of California, and the National Geographic, and they found that head again. They not only found that head, but the following year they proceeded to another spot, La Venta, where someone noted they had seen a similar head, and they dug up 4 heads at La Venta. Between 1939 and 1940, 4 heads were dug up at La Venta, and again it was the same thing. Enormous heads, 6 to 9 feet high, just a head, weighing between 10 to 40 tons in weight, having African-type features, and the same type of helmet. As Jarazboy has pointed out, you could find it at Tanis in the Egyptian Delta, with a flap falling along the side of the head. A kind of crest with a flap and incised markings, etc. And the extraordinary thing is that I discovered last year through a friend of mine, he's Wayne Chandler, he's an photojournalist. He discovered in the files of the Smithsonian a photograph that has been suppressed for nearly 50 years, which is shown here for the first time in public in my slides, which shows that the first head that was discovered not only had African features, but Ethiopian braids. It's carved out in the stone. It has never been published, it has never been shown. Top of the heads, the stone heads, they found terracottas, that is clay sculptures of Africa. On the wooden ceremonial platform where 4 of these stone heads were found at La Venta, which turned out to be the holy capital of the Olmec world, O-L-M-E-C. Olmec, the first major civilization in America. The dating of the wooden platform, the charcoal, there were 9 samples of charcoal dating, gave a reading of 948 to 680 BC. It's not just the stone head, but in addition to the stone heads, you have terracottas that are clay sculptures of African types. Not only the nose now and the lips, the hair is clearly Africoid. Because even though you have You could say that some Asiatic types who came across the Bering Straits may have Africoid type features. The hair now is very distinctive, the kink and coil of the Africoid hair, very distinctive on the head of the terracottas. And what is more, and note this, the artist went to the trouble of selecting oxide dyes for the clay so that it could be dark brown or dark red or dark black, so that it could be distinguished from the other terracottas. So that on the dark terracottas you're finding this African peculiarity of feature. And in addition to that, in addition to the stone heads, of which there are 14 spread over Tres de Portes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo in Veracruz, in addition to the terracottas spread all over that Olmec central area, you have skeletal evidence. Professor Wierzyński, a Polish skull expert, was able to show after a study at Tlatelolco, at Cerro de las Misas, and at Monte Alban, in the dry areas of the Olmec civilization, where the Olmec from the swamps had moved into these areas. He showed Africoid types. He said it's probably West African. Nowhere on earth, on any archaeological site, could you find a corroboration of so much evidence. Stone heads representing a distinct physical type, terracottas representing the same type with the texture of hair and coloration of skin, and skeletal evidence representing that type as high as 13.5% at Tlatelolco, going down to 4.5% at Monte Alban. And you yet deny the existence of that type because it involved African and it could not be there. Okay, so some Africans came to America before Columbus, so what? What did they do? Thank God they've changed the tune, because now I'm going to show what they did. Because we have evidence of what they did do, because it leaves marks. The first pyramid to appear in America appears right at La Venta, on the very same ceremonial platform where the stone heads first appear. In the first of the sequence, although they find later Tres de Portes and San Lorenzo, the first of the sequence of the stone heads is at La Venta, and both the conical pyramid as well as the step pyramid appear. They said, well, but the functions are not the same. It's just a temple in America, it's a tomb in Egypt. That is not true. We have found many pyramids could be sited in America which serve both as tomb as well as temple. And in Egypt, many of the great pyramids have temples adjoined. So they have both the tomb and temple combination. And the great ones, the very great ones, the one at Teotihuacan in Mexico and the one at Gizeh in Egypt, they not only have the same base, the identical base, but they also have the third function, the geodetic marker, or the use of the movable capstone for astronomy, the notches, etc. They said at first that the Teotihuacan pyramid was 1 meter off from the Egyptian pyramid. Now they're allowing that meter because of mistakes in the reconstruction and excavation, which means it's roughly the same base as the Egyptian pyramid. I'm not saying Africans built the pyramid in America, don't misunderstand me. I am saying ideas and influences were carried forward by that migrating group. There was a reason why there may have been Egyptians and Nubians in the Atlantic. They have no business being in the Atlantic. Egypt is too far away from the Atlantic. But there were reasons at that time, 3 reasons. First of all, there was a war with Asia. The Asiatics, the Syrian forces in Asia, the mighty power of Western Asia, were moving down the Mediterranean with their iron-powered armies. They had captured the Jews. The blacks saved the Jews in 701 BC, when Taharqa, the great Ethiopian general, before he became king, head of the Ethiopian Egyptian forces, marched into Jerusalem to save the Jews. They were when King Hezekiah of the Jews was trembling before the Asiatics. The Africans entered the battlefield and the Asiatics were defeated. There was a war going on. They had closed the eastern seaports. They found trade by Egyptians right up to Hawaii. They found Egyptian trade goods and scripts as far as Hawaii, as Dr. Fell has shown. They had closed those trade routes. The Egyptians and the Phoenicians, who were accounted for 50% of Egyptian import-export trade, were forced west of the Mediterranean. Script. Barry Fell has shown among the Micmac a whole series of words in astronomy. As much as 90% in one area, 90% of the astronomy words are identical with Egyptian, the sounds. You go to the script and you look at the Iberian, Punic, the Libyan and Egyptian together, and the Davenport Stela, the hymn to the Aton written in the American. He's written a book on the Micmac, challenges me. I said, all right, sir, if you think that this is a fake, I have both before me. I have the Micmac and I have the Egyptian. You are so acquainted with the Micmac. Show me which is which. I don't want to be drawn in that, he said. But the audience, they really embarrassed him. They said, show him which is the fake. Didn't dare do it. There's so many, and it is true that in scripts you can have occasional parallels because there's a limit to human science, but these things were for arbitrary things, very complex markings for arbitrary things. And there was no question of correspondence. Correspondence so remarkable, so plentiful that there was no question, no statistical possibility of accident or fluke or coincidence. You go to Elvia John in the Olmec world, and there is paper made from wood pulp. Nowhere in America were they making paper from wood pulp. Nowhere in the world, except in Egypt at that time, where both the papyrus and the wood pulp was making paper. It was done in China later. It appears in the Olmec world. Isolated incident that appears in the Olmec world. You go and look at their other aspects of their technology. Professor Heiser, who had attacked this thesis all his life, in the last 3 years of his life, he was converted. Do you know what he did? He stopped publishing. He started writing things in favor of the Egyptian thesis, but he didn't publish it. It is now in the Smithsonian as posthumous files. There is where we have found that Heiser showed that the heavy transport techniques the Native Americans were using in the swamps were identical with Egyptian heavy transport techniques. All of us marvel at the Egyptians, how they move those incredible stones, taking 50-ton capstones and putting it at the top of their skyscrapers without being a fraction of an inch off. And these guys are suddenly, people, they were marvelous at sculpture, yes, but they're suddenly making these colossal things which they never made before. Making it out of this incredible basalt stone, one block of stone. Some of them close to 40 tons in weight, bringing them down from the quarries to their platforms and building them up with the same skill and technological ingenuity the Egyptians when they hadn't been doing it before. How come? How come when we go to the Middle Americans and study the way they have, not the exact proportions because the individual pyramids change, but they have so many things in their mathematics that are close, as the man who was recently Peter Tompkins, who's done studies of the Mexican pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids, so the correspondences, the structural correspondences, even in spite of superficial difference. And when we come to ritual, that is the most astonishing thing, and I must give great credit to Jairaj Boy for what he's done in ritual. Jairaj Boy showed several gods of the Egyptian that are identical with the American. There is the god Sokar. He is standing there and he has open arms, outstretched arms, and he has wings on his arms, and he's standing on the back of a snake, and the snake has a head at the head and a head at the tail. You go to Mexico, and there is this god standing there with arms outstretched, wings on his arms, standing on a snake with a head at the head and a head at the tail. How come? The god Aken, he pointed to the double rope swallowing god, identical. Faceless Aken with the double, swallowing the double rope, there in Mexico in the Olmec world. He shows feathered sunshades, made of 3 concentric circles, 3 colors. These are very detailed things. These are very complex correspondences. They're not flukes. And there you find the same thing duplicated. The double crown. Who wears the double crown in all the world except the Egyptians who united the north and south, for whom there was a political necessity to have a double crown, the red and the white crown. And there among the Olmec, we found two examples of it now. Chief dignitaries wearing a double crown. The flail, the crook, you find it on the Olmec dignitaries as among the Egyptians. The use of purple, we have found the codex. A codex is recent, Natal Codex, showing pictures of black-skinned as well as red-skinned kings in ancient America. And you look at the nobility, you look at the women, you look at the kings, the priest kings, and you find purple as a symbol, as a signal of their index of their rank, just like among the Egyptians. And there's recently been done a study in purple, the Phoenician thing about purple. Their search for purple, because purple was sacred among the Egyptians, it is emblematic of the power of the gods. And the Phoenicians, in their travels, exhausted most of the purple supplies in the Mediterranean. There is another suggestion of why they should have come to the Americas for this purpose. You look at other ritual scenes. The human-headed bird, ba, is found in Mexico. A bird with a human head. This is in Egypt and on the Egyptian tombs, and they have a little hole in the tomb with the bird to fly out. You see it duplicated in America. Nowhere else. All these correspondences. How come? How can you explain that these things were not happening before? They have no antecedent. They are complex. They are not just single traits. They are a complex of interlocking parallels. Why should we believe that it took Columbus, who stumbled into the Caribbean, which he called Asia? Do you know Columbus called America India? It wasn't called America, it was called India. That is why we're still calling the Americans Indians. We still call the Native Americans Indians. Columbus had a right theory, which in fact was not new. The Arabs and Africans knew the world was round. You look at the globes that Africans used and Arabs used to teach geography. They were all wrong. It's only Europeans believed the world was flat, until some of their geniuses were persecuted, proving that it was wrong. They were upset because the Portuguese, both King John I and II, had refused to give Columbus permission or support. And now the Spanish were going to rule two worlds. That they asked Columbus to go back home and argue for a line to be drawn across the world to separate the claims of the two Catholic kingdoms. This was known as the Tordesillas Line. It was signed on June the 4th, 1494, before the discovery of South America by Europeans, before Cabral had got there in 1500. And it was drawn across. The Pope did not give it his blessing until afterwards, but it was drawn in 1494 in the Treaty of Tordesillas, and it includes South America, and they'd never seen it. It includes Brazil, 200 miles of territory from that ocean going right back. And why did the Portuguese do that? They hadn't been there. They were concentrating in the route along Africa up into India because of the strength of knowledge they got from Africans, who were aware of a southern land mass, just below the equinoctial line within the same latitudes as Guinea. And Columbus was told about it. Columbus went back to Spain and argued, because he was then Prince of the Ocean Sea. He came almost like a king. He was nothing. He argued with the Spanish that they should agree with the Portuguese, let them draw the line, because there's only water within the line. It's only 375 leagues from the Cape Verde, which is 4.5 miles according to Vespucci. Roman miles give it 4, but they give it 4.5, about 1,600 miles. And Columbus said, nothing to worry about, you're not giving anything to the Portuguese. I have traveled twice as many leagues, and I have found no such land, which is true, because Europe is twice as far from America as is Africa. But when Columbus was on his second voyage, a man called Jaime Ferrer appeared in the Spanish court and told Ferdinand and Isabella that Columbus was lying, that he had knowledge from Arabs and Ethiopians. The word Ethiopian was generally used for African. that there was a landmass to the south within the line, that the demarcation line they were drawing up between the Portuguese claims and the claims of the Spanish. And he said a damaging thing. He said, Columbus knows more about this sleeping than I do waking. So when Columbus was sent a letter from the King of Spain, he said, please come home immediately. And I want to know all that you know about this demarcation line. Columbus wrote back to say, I have arthritis and I am too ill to move. And then he said something which was a deliberate lie because he knew it was not true. He said, Cuba is the continent. I have found the continent. I'm no longer among the islands. Cuba is the continent because my ships cannot circumnavigate it. He knew that was not true, because whether his little ships could circumnavigate it or not, the natives had lived there for centuries and had told him so, and he had made this clear to the Chancellor of Aragon months before this missive. So when he came back, they didn't want to hear anything more about colonizing the Caribbean. They wanted to send him to find the southern landmass, so they gave him 6 ships. And he sent 3 ships along on the earlier route, and he sent 3 ships along Africa. And here are the 3 ships coming down into the Cape Verde, searching for black animals, going into the Senegambia current, then into the tropical latitudes. And they landed 1 day's journey from South America. They landed in a place where they saw 3 hills. And he said those 3 hills reminded him of the Trinity, so he called it Trinidad. Very religious man. The next day, the ships landed in South America. Columbus did not come off the ship. The great navigator, so eager to explore, would not come off the ship because he's terrified to give the Portuguese away. Because I found the letter he wrote to his son Diego Columbus in 1505, in which Amerigo Vespucci is about to appear before the Spanish court. And he says, tell him to do this and to say this and to say that and to do this and to do that, because the man would do anything for me. It was his brother, Genoese brother, tricking both the Spanish and the Portuguese. And he said, certain monies are being paid to me, but I cannot detail them here. I'll detail them yonder. What money is he talking about? Not Spanish money for the prospective discoveries in America. It's the Portuguese money for keeping the Spanish away from the south. That's why Columbus pretended he had an arthritic fit, because he did not want to go into the south. That is why he was arrested. How many of us are aware of that? On his 4th voyage, he was arrested by Bobadilla, he and his brother Bartholomew, and sent back like a black in the hold of the ship to be tried in Spain. So all this Columbus period is built upon a fraud. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, took a papyrus reed boat, which the Egyptians had used and the Ethiopians had used on their inland lakes and elsewhere. And he showed that the curves of this boat showed that it could cross the ocean. It wasn't just for inland shipping, and it was used 800 years before Christ. And he said it can cross the Atlantic. And scientists scoffed at him. Scientists took the papyrus reed and they said, if you put it in a tank, it will sink. And they put it in the tank and it sank. And Heyerdahl said, if I took a piece of the Queen Mary, which is made of iron, and put it in a tank, it would also sink. So, rising above the idiocies of the scientists, he built the papyrus reed boat with the help of Abdullah de Jibrin and the Baduma people on Lake Chad in 1969. And they sailed across the Atlantic successfully. They only got in trouble off Barbados because the Africans had cut a rope which was attached to the bow and the deck. And they cut that rope thinking it merely had to do with curvature and of the bow. In fact, it was a flotation device. That was the only mistake they made. When the Aymara Indians, without the help of African experience, rebuilt the identical boat, because on Lake Titicaca in South America, the identical boat was being used that was used by the Egyptians. They crossed the Atlantic in the Ra 2. And the strange thing about the Ra 1 is that, as I have said, it did not steer to America. It came by itself. The rudders broke on the first day. They could not steer. The currents took the thing from Africa and landed it in America. And Heyerdahl is not the only one. There have been 120 experiments with small boats across the Atlantic. And it has been shown that the small boat can arrive earlier than Columbus or Vespucci. And a man who showed that, you have experiments by Alain Bombard and Hans Lindman. Bombard set out in a dugout, which no African would be mad enough to use on the Atlantic. He set out in a dugout without a crew, without a sail, and crossed the Atlantic safely from Africa to America in less time than either Columbus or Vespucci. And talking about the boats of Columbus and Vespucci, the sails on those boats were Arab Latin sails, which Arabs and Africans had used on the Indian Ocean. They were not European sails. The compass was not invented in Europe. The astrolabe was not invented in Europe. It is true that after the massive and continuous migrations of people to the Americas, that you had an improvement in hulls, an improvement in ships, which went far beyond the other conquered peoples. But at that time, those boats were not superior. So to think that man had to sit down and wait for centuries until the stumble of Columbus landed in India and called Cuba the continent and South America an island, this has nothing to do with the truth of the past. There's a whole world out there. Every time I go back into Mexico, extraordinary things are found. They found the pyramid of Comalcalco with bricks, with various writings, boats, scripts thereon, which has recently been found. A whole new set of things are emerging. This is not a finished chapter. This is no closed chapter. This last chapter has been written with a certain eye, an eye which has been blind to the genius of the African.
It's kind of hypocritical because people love to, have mercy and sympathy for everything, from the animals to the whales to fur to everything except us, your youth, the ones who you give no attention to, who become adults with no compassion. You know what I mean? And I feel like if you walk by a street and you was walking on concrete and you saw a rose growing out of concrete, even if it had messed up petals and it was a little, to the side, you would marvel at just seeing a rose grow through concrete. So why is it that when you see some ghetto kid grow out of all of the dirtiest circumstances and he can talk and he can sit across from you, make you smile, make you cry, make you laugh, all you can talk about is my dirty rose, my dirty stems, and how I'm leaning crooked to the side. You can't even see that I came up out of that shit. And that's exactly the analogy that it is for me.
White and who was black. By 1925, nearly every state had a form of the one-drop rule on their books. It began during slavery.
What's one drop mean?
You got any black ancestry in you at all, and you're black.
Black over here, you're enslaved. White over here, you're free. But y'all are coming in the middle, and you don't look like Yaba, and you don't look like white man, so what are you?
They were, for the most part, children of rape. White master, black slave.
And historically, whiteness has been defined as pure. The government then came to define blackness as anybody with any trace of African ancestry. Any trace. So this definition of blackness has come to be defined as the one-drop rule. So we've got this pure bottle of white, clear, pure water. Now, what would happen if we were to take some black paint? Just one drop. Let's see. Let's shake it up and see.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. Oh.
That once pure water to quench your thirst has now been contaminated. What this one drop has come to mean in history is 1/32nd of Negro/Black/African blood. All you need is one person 5 generations back who is black. And that is enough to make you black. Take a guess when it was ruled unconstitutional. What year? 1967. The one-drop rule was an attempt to save the so-called purity of the white race.
So then why do so many black people hold on to the one-drop rule? Me included, right? I think I'm black because my mother's black.
The one-drop rule, racist as it is, actually gave us parameters for our community. We know who was black, we knew who wasn't, we knew what our issues were.